So Washington politicians love to scapegoat illegal immigrants for this country's economic woes, but almost never do you hear about the illegal actions taken by Border Patrol agents themselves. Well, in 2012, an independent report on this very topic was commissioned by U.S. Customs and Border Protection, or CBP. It was completed in February of 2013. Except 15 months later, the report still hasn't been made public. See, last week we learned that CPB has refused to comply with an open records request to release the report in order to protect the, quote, free and frank exchange of information among agency personnel. Right. I'm sure it has nothing to do with the fact the report offered up a blistering picture of how immigrants are actually treated in this country. See, thanks to an investigation by the Arizona Republic, we know that at least 45 people have been killed by CPB agents since 2005, including 3 teenagers that were shot in the back. And perhaps most stunning is that no agents have been reprimanded for their actions. Furthermore, according to leaked documents provided to the LA Times from the report, the investigation found that Border Patrol agents do everything from intentionally stepping in front of moving cars to justify using deadly force to firing bullets at rock throwers when they could have just moved away. So if you think it's unacceptable for an agency to hide its own report out of sheer embarrassment, then join me and let's break the set.
It was a terrible mistake, and we're working very hard to make up for it.
And once again, we put something on the air. It's a flat-out lie.
Have you ever had sex with Governor Rick Perry?
No, wait. Do not answer that.
I want you to watch what we're about to do because you've never seen anything like this on television.
What we need is to question more and to keep it uncensored, real and raw. My simple mission is to change the globe. I'ma do it with this passion and fire with told. These ones are hard hitting, you're watching your neck, but you need to tune in because we're breaking the set. Breaking the set.
Well, today was graduation for hundreds of elite students attending West Point Academy in New York, one of the most prestigious military schools in the country. And at today's commencement ceremony, President Obama himself gave this speech, but not to wish graduates luck in their careers. Instead, he used the platform to outline his entire foreign policy agenda for the remainder of his term. He started by prepping us for another Cold War, boasting for the millionth time about he killed bin Laden and put an end to Bush's wars, even though he's leaving almost 10,000 troops in Afghanistan past the, quote, 2014 withdrawal. But then he had some words to share for all those naysayers out there who say that engaging in constant warfare and military meddling around the world is actually hurting the country.
America has rarely been stronger relative to the rest of the world. Those who argue otherwise, who suggest that America is in decline or has seen its global leadership slip away, are either misreading history or engaged in partisan politics.
Yes, apparently we're just misreading history, guys. America's never been better, and anyone who says otherwise is just trying to be partisan. That's funny. I thought that calling out both Democrats and Republicans alike for perpetuating policies that will cause the inevitable downfall of the American empire is the opposite of partisan. But Obama also went on to talk about how important the international community is when engaging in future foreign policy excursions.
International opinion matters. But America should never ask permission to protect our people, our homeland, or our way of life.
International opinion, like the enormous outcry from world leaders and Americans alike over the near bombing campaign in Syria. I'm pretty sure Syrians aren't interested in taking away Americans' right to shop at Walmart or eat fast food. But of course, his contempt for the international support wasn't the only Orwellian thing said. Obama's roundabout justification for the continued use of killer drones held zero water.
In taking direct action, we must uphold standards that reflect our values. That means taking strikes only when we face a continuing imminent threat, and only where there is near certainty of no civilian casualties. For our actions should meet a simple test. We must not create more enemies than we take off the battlefield.
Wow. So basically what he just said is that every single time he chose to kill human beings with drones, it was because Americans faced an imminent threat. He also said that he sends drones to kill only when there's near certainty of no civilian casualties. What he really means by that, if you're simply of military age in the vicinity of a strike, well, then you're just another dead terrorist, not worthy of due process. The oft-repeated no civilian casualties line gets old. The more civilians dead are stacked up. According to the Bureau of Investigative Journalism, up to 5,261 people have died by way of drones thus far. And also, according to the Bureau of Investigative Journalism, the vast majority of drone strikes target domestic homes in Pakistan, over 60% in fact. But all of this criminal unaccountability is okay because of one supreme notion.
I believe in American exceptionalism with every fiber of my being. But what makes us exceptional is not our ability to flout international norms and the rule of law. It is our willingness to affirm them through our actions.
This is an infant nation with an out-of-control superiority complex, and the idea that Americans are better and are given the moral authority to use military force anywhere in the world is perverse and toxic. And no other leader agrees with this. They simply go along with it out of sheer bullying from the world's largest military, bigger than the next 10 countries combined, in fact. And don't even get me started on the doublespeak.
That's why I will continue to push to close Gitmo, because American values and legal traditions do not permit the indefinite detention of people beyond our borders.
Obama wants to close Gitmo so badly that he hasn't actually used his executive power to do it. Empty platitudes about how much you want to doesn't mean too much when you could easily sign national security waivers and close it today. He doesn't just care about Gitmo detainees having the right to due process. He's also done everything in his power to make sure that American citizens can legally be indefinitely detained. First, by signing the NDAA of 2012, which included an unprecedented provision allowing the military to indefinitely detain U.S. citizens without charges or trial. Then when he was sued over it, he placed an emergency stay to make sure the measure stayed in place. And given the global upset over the NSA spying machine, Obama's speech just wouldn't be complete without a commitment to the surveillance state.
That's why we're putting in place new restrictions on how America collects and uses intelligence. Because we will have fewer partners and be less effective if a perception takes hold that we're conducting surveillance against ordinary citizens.
Oh my God, Obama, you are spying against ordinary citizens. You know, it's astounding that he can get up there and say all of this with a straight and stern face. But I guess it's to be expected, because in a country that's more exceptional than the rest, we better have the best liars, too. Female genital mutilation, or FGM, is a horrifying practice involving the partial or total removal of a woman's genitalia. The practice is primarily associated with populations in sub-Saharan Africa or northeastern Africa, but because of immigration, it's now growing in Western countries as well. However, the extent of FGM in the Western world is largely unknown due to a lack of research. But one woman, who is a survivor of FGM, has just received more than 100,000 signatures on a petition that calls for the U.S. government to commission a report on the issue. Earlier, I was joined by the author of that petition, Jaha Dukara, and I started by asking her to outline some of the biggest myths associated with FGM.
You know, a lot of people actually believe that FGM is a religious obligation, but FGM is not prescribed by any religion, Muslims or Christian. And you know, back home where I'm from, they do it purely to keep women chaste until marriage, because they believe that by performing FGM, that would make you stay a virgin until you get married. And after you get married, it will keep you faithful to your husband. Another reason why FGM is performed is because they believe that it makes a woman pure, and it also makes you cleaner as a woman. But these are all myths that, you know, have been just passed on, you know, from generations to generations, and now it's just been around so long that it's so hard to get rid of it and change the mindsets of people that this is harmful, and there's no reason why any woman should have to go through this.
Right. And bring it back to your story. I mean, when girls are mutilated, talk about what happened to you physiologically, physically, psychologically, and what can happen to other women as well.
For me personally, it happened when I was a week old, and because of that, I really don't remember the physical pain aspect of it, but just growing up. And when I got married the first time and had to be reopened back up, that to me felt like this is the first time this has happened to me. And because of that, and just knowing that something so precious, something that was a part of me was taken away from me, something that I will never get back, and something that I don't know what it will feel like if I hadn't gone through FGM. You know, I can hear about it, I can, you know, listen to what doctors and experts have to say about it, but as a woman, I want to experience what that would have been like, because I feel like it's my God-given right. I was born perfectly fine. If God felt something was wrong with me, he would have, you know, not given me a clitoris. And the fact that that was just taken away from me is just something that you have to live with and something that you have to think about. It, you know, it makes you self-conscious about your body. And I know that most women that have been through FGM feel exactly the same way that I do.
Jaha, where is FGM currently practiced in the world, and would you say that it's on the decline or rise overall?
FGM is practiced in 28 countries, and this includes Africa and the Middle East. But when you have Western countries like America, UK, and most of Europe, you have people that migrate to those countries and they bring their cultures and traditions with them, and these are not things that they can easily abandon. So FGM is practiced in Western countries as well.
I think a lot of people don't realize how widespread it is. It's kind of internationally condemned in the media and political establishment, but if it's still being practiced, where it's happening every day around the world, give us a little bit of the insight on the scale here.
It is estimated that 3 million women go through FGM every single year. And when you think about that, and you know, FGM happens normally in other parts of the world, like where I'm from in the Gambia, it is acceptable. There's nothing wrong with taking groups of girls and putting them through FGM because that's their culture and that's something that they believe in. And parents that move to the United States that think this is part of who they are, you know, they still practice it. And it's just something that these people believe. And a lot of them think that it's a religious obligation that they have to do to kind of, you know, because some kind of way, a lot of people have been brainwashed to think that this is something that you must do. And anytime someone comes speaking against it, it's a problem. And then we have something called a culture of silence, wherein women are not allowed to talk about their sexuality. Women are not allowed to talk about how they feel. Whenever you have a woman that comes up and says that, well, there's something wrong with my body and I don't feel good about a certain thing, then people start judging you, people start talking bad about you. And I think that's why FGM continues to happen, because there's not a lot of survivors that are actually standing up and saying, this is wrong, this is how this has affected me, and I don't want this happening to my daughter, I don't want this happening to my younger sister.
Is it being actually institutionalized and being done by medical professionals, or is it being done just off the radar here?
No, FGM is not performed by medical professionals. It's usually done in secret, and most of the time kids are being sent abroad where FGM is being done to them, and then they are brought back. And normally when it happens, it's normally happened by, let's say, the midwives in the communities that are not medically trained, and sometimes they use the same razors on multiple kids, and this exposes them to STDs and other diseases that they can be exposed to. So it's something that we all need to be worried about as humans. This is not just their issue, it's everyone's issue. It's a human issue. And I think a lot of people need to care about this issue more and do more to help these girls that are at risk.
Absolutely.
There's no reason why you should be born in America and still be at risk of going through something as inhumane as FGM.
Jaha Dukare, activist, survivor of female genital mutilation. Really appreciate you coming on.
Thank you.
Coming up, I'll talk about even more bad news for the city of Detroit.
What are your thoughts on what's been going on in Washington?
Well, it's a mess, Larry. I mean, the whole country is being scoffed at and laughed at.
Enough is enough.
The media, the candidates, the corporatocracy, covering issues that actually affect you and me doesn't do too much for ad revenue.
Biotech agriculture giant takes on a 76-year-old American farmer based in Indiana.
How much fallout do you think this is going to create for the CIA?
Do you think this is what's triggering the crisis?
America's the largest economy in the world. It's also the largest debtor nation in the history of the world.
Breaking the set is mostly about alternatives to the status quo, but one that gave real alternatives a voice.
One minute they were working toward the American dream, the next they were just trying to survive the night. It's time for Americans and lawmakers in Washington to wake up and start talking about the real causes of poverty in America.
The Obama administration consistently touts the 50 straight months of private sector job growth and a falling unemployment rate as a sign that the U.S. economy is back on track. But of course, the unemployment rate is declining almost exclusively due to people dropping out of the workforce out of desperation and hopelessness. And perhaps no city in America exemplifies the havoc that the 2008 financial crisis continues to wreak than the city of Detroit. See, back in July, Detroit became the largest municipality in U.S. history to file for bankruptcy, thanks largely to a collapsed auto industry and predatory Wall Street banks that took advantage of the city's economic desperation. Now, beyond the fact that the city's $18 to $20 billion in debt, Detroit's pension system for city employees is broken beyond repair. And during bankruptcy negotiations, city officials have offered up everything from selling off the city's art collection to slashing pensions by 40% to keep Detroit's finances afloat. Keep in mind that pensions are supposed to be guaranteed retirement funds that thousands of former Detroit employees depend on for their day-to-day livelihood. University of Massachusetts economics professor Richard Wolff came on the show a few months back to discuss this very issue.
The bailout at the highest estimates of the city's obligations to the pensioners is estimated to be $3.5 billion. By contrast, the federal government gave to General Motors $50 billion. General Motors is a company. Detroit is a city which at that time of the bailout, almost 1 million people. Democracy alone would say, if you can bail out a company for $50 billion, you can find $3.5 billion to save thousands of people's pensions.
But it turns out that reneging on guaranteed pensions are just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to the Motor City's economic grief. Just yesterday, a stunning report from Detroit's Blight Removal Task Force found that nearly 85,000 buildings are in decay, and nearly half of them need to be destroyed at a cost of $2 billion. And it's not just the monetary cost of this cleanup effort that's depressing the entire city. The report notes that, quote, blight, or urban decay, is a drag on community energy. It's a siphon on city vitality. Blight is a strong deterrent to economic investment and a proven threat to public safety. Blight can be a source of despair or cynicism for people who have witnessed a decline of a particular building or neighborhood over time. And consider that even if Detroit demolishes 7,000 structures a year, it would still take 11 years to rid the community of these abandoned buildings. That's the broken windows theory at its finest, and it's leading to an unfathomable crime rate in the city. Detroit's violent crime is 5 times higher than the national average, and its murder rate is 11 times higher than New York City. Police have even told people to enter the city at your own risk. Of course, any capital investment in Detroit from the state of Michigan would help at this point, except that many of the same powerful forces that created the crisis are now trying to prevent even minor economic relief from happening. Check this out. Americans for Prosperity, a political group backed by the Koch brothers, are actually lobbying against a state plan that would inject $195 million into Detroit, all to teach Detroit's politicians a lesson. Because, of course, they're the ones who are really suffering here. According to Scott Hagerstrom, the Michigan director for Americans for Prosperity, quote, Detroit has behaved like this for 30 years. Politicians there won't change their behavior if they keep getting bailouts from the hardworking taxpayers of Michigan. Wow, because I'm sure Michigan residents would rather have their once prosperous city fall further into despair. You know, with the amount of money the Koch brothers have spent lobbying against this effort, they probably could have saved the city's pension system themselves. But hey, every predatory capitalist system has to have its sacrifice zones, and Detroit's just the latest city in the crosshairs. From fast food employees receiving poverty-level wages in the U.S. to near slave labor conditions by Bangladeshi garment workers all around the world, laborers' rights are being diminished. And just last week, the International Trade Union Confederation published its annual report outlining the countries where the working class fares the worst and the best. The report ranks countries on a scale of 1 to 5, with 5 meaning the worst protection for workers. Of the list, Denmark was the only country in the world to pull off a perfect score. But sadly, in a country where the American dream was once attainable, the U.S. scored a dismal 4, a disturbing statistic that reflects systemic efforts nationwide to stifle workers' rights. So to go over the findings of the study and what it means for American workers, I'm joined now by labor and employment attorney Ben Dichter. Thank you so much for coming on, Ben.
Hi, thank you for having me.
So Ben, after reviewing the report yourself, what sort of working conditions lead to such a low ranking on the list?
Well, I think that what we can really glean from this study is that bad laws beget bad conditions, and there's sort of a linked relationship between the two. So where you have laws that don't protect workers' rights to organize, you wind up seeing a furthering of those bad laws, and the cycle continues. So in the United States, for instance, the lack of protections for workers to engage in collective bargaining and to form unions and to associate freely with one another has really, over decades of time now, resulted in the condition that we see workers in today.
And Denmark and Uruguay are leading the way when it comes to workers' rights. I mean, what sets these two countries apart?
Well, sure. What the study looked at was what laws were in place and also what mechanisms were in place to enforce those laws when there are violations. Uruguay presents a really interesting example because of a law that was passed in 2009 that really strengthened collective bargaining rights, but also created some very interesting mechanisms for enforcement when, say, a union and an employer reach impasse on bargaining over a contract or wages. The government can actually get involved, and either party can sort of bring them into the picture to help settle the dispute. And unions have relied on that since its passage and have really fought back, particularly in the public sector.
I heard something from a top stock analyst, Ronnie Moaz, who said that McDonald's workers in Denmark make $4,000 a month, 6 weeks vacation. Sounds like a pretty good deal compared to the dismal working conditions for fast food workers here. Ben, shockingly, the U.S. received a ranking of 4, on par with Kuwait, which according to the index means that, quote, these countries have reported systemic violations against workers. The government and or companies are engaged in a serious effort to crush the collective voice of workers, putting fundamental rights under continuous threat. I mean, that's pretty strong language here, Ben. And as you said, I mean, collective bargaining rights have pretty much been under assault since the 1930s. Can you give us just a brief timeline of how we got to this point?
Sure. I mean, really, unfortunately, the high watermark for collective bargaining rights in the United States was the Wagner Act in 1935. And before that time, it was criminal in many states to engage in union organizing. Federal law eliminated those criminalities, and it gave considerable rights to workers to organize and protected them from retaliation. But since that time, legislators have really chipped away at those rights. And the state that we see today, we have really a dismal situation in terms of what especially certain subgroups of workers' rights are in the United States when they try to either form unions or collectively bargain. Unlike Uruguay, when you reach impasse in the United States, there's very little you can do. You have the right to bargain, but frankly, the mechanisms for making that bargaining mean anything in terms of real gains by workers anymore has really been chipped away at, and the tools that unions used to have, especially the right to strike, has been so strongly undermined in the decades after the Wagner Act that really there's not much left of that today.
And Alex, crushing of unions and also just that phrase "right to work" is very confusing, and people don't really understand what the assault is that's going on from these lobbying efforts. The Huffington Post compiled some pretty stunning global comparisons to the U.S. For example, many people have no chance at retirement, barely get paid time off, work longer hours, more days. Ben, aside from just kind of this collective assault on a federal level, how do we get to the point culturally where we are living to work, it seems like, more than most countries?
Well, again, a lot of it, I think, has to do with the relationship between the decline in rights and the decline in unionization. We have something like just over 6% of the private sector workforce is unionized. And where you don't have organized worker power, you tend to see rights slip away. A pension used to be something that Americans associated with their job. You work hard your whole life, you retire comfortably. And today, that's no longer the case. People in my generation have no concept of what a pension is. And as the Huffington Post article points out, many Americans responding to a survey tell you that they'll work until they die. That's quite a distance from the era where you had a pension for life.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people look at things like pensions and they're like, oh, I don't want to get anything for free, even though it isn't. They have this mindset that you got to pull yourself up by your bootstraps and work for what you have, even though that really isn't attainable anymore, Ben. And they're kind of forgetting about all these things that did exist for the last couple decades. I mean, your area of focus is the rights for undocumented workers. You've noted that the U.S. technically gives collective bargaining rights to undocumented workers, but there's no way they can exercise them. Can you expand on that?
Sure. Just over a decade ago, the Supreme Court ruled that while undocumented workers have collective bargaining rights under the National Labor Relations Act, they aren't entitled to the fundamental remedies under that act that enforce those rights. So essentially, an undocumented worker can be fired in the course of an organizing campaign and be left with no remedies, but you could have the National Labor Relations Board step in and say, oh, well, their rights were violated. So it's sort of, in a sense, meaningless. But this shouldn't in any way dissuade workers from organizing, because the only way we're ever going to get these rights back, and the only way labor is ever going to be able to protect its gains and regain ground, is if workers continue to organize and continue to fight back like we see them doing in the fast food campaigns and in a variety of other campaigns, especially right here in New York City.
Ben, as an employment attorney, I'm sure that you see a lot of things firsthand, the struggle in the streets. The report gives us a good idea of what countries are doing right, what countries are doing wrong, but little in the way of how to improve the conditions. I mean, give us some tools here of what workers can do to improve their lives here in America.
They have to organize. I mean, there's a very simple answer to that question, and it is that they have to organize. You have to remember that, like I said, before the 1935 Wagner Act, it was unlawful in many places to organize. It was considered a criminal conspiracy to try to organize a union, to try to fight for better wages. And it was because people broke those laws and because of the mass waves of organizing that happened in the first decades of the last century that we were able to make legal gains. This isn't a fight that's won in the courtroom, it's won in the streets. So workers really need to hit the ground. You know, there's going to be plenty of fights in the courtroom for lawyers to handle, but the reality is all of the historical gains of labor have been made in the streets.
Absolutely. Well said. Thank you so much, Benjamin Dichter, labor and employment attorney. Really appreciate you coming on.
Thank you.
To close out the show, you guys, we wanted to bid farewell to one of the most revered literary icons of our time, Maya Angelou. Angelou passed away at the age of 86 in her North Carolina home early this evening, leaving behind her life's work, a collection of poetry, novels, and music that earned her Pulitzer Prize and 3 Grammys, among dozens of other honors. Having worked alongside some of the most important civil rights leaders in American history, Maya Angelou also leaves behind a legacy of social justice that has transcended generations. Aside from seeing beauty in all things, perhaps the most important message she ever gave us was to remember to love. In Maya Angelou's words, we spend precious hours fearing the inevitable. It'd be wise to use that time adoring our families, cherishing our friends, and living our lives.
Yeah, I take no prisoners, you call it aggressive, but all I see is lies coming out in your message. I keep it audacious, speaking the facts. We break the paradigm with truth and
Times from the report, the investigation found that Border Patrol agents do everything from intentionally stepping in front of moving cars to justify using deadly force to firing bullets at rock throwers when they could have just moved away. So if you think it's unacceptable for an agency to hide its own report out of sheer embarrassment, then join me and let's break the set.
It was a terrible mistake, and we're working very hard to make up for it.
And once again, we put something on the air. It's a flat-out lie.
Have you ever had sex with Governor Rick Perry?
No, wait, do not answer that.
I want you to watch what we're about to do because you've never seen anything like this on television.
What we need is to question more and to keep it uncensored, real and raw. My simple mission is to change the globe. I'ma do it with this passion and fire we're told. These words are hard hitting, you're watching your neck, but you need to tune in because we're breaking the set. Breaking the set. Breaking the set.
Well, today was graduation for hundreds of elite students attending West Point Academy in New York, one of the most prestigious military schools in the country. And at today's commencement ceremony, President Obama himself gave a speech, but not to wish graduates luck in their careers. Instead, he used the platform to outline his entire foreign policy agenda for the remainder of his term. He started by prepping us for another Cold War, boasting for the millionth time about he killed bin Laden and put an end to Bush's wars, even though he's leaving almost 10,000 troops in Afghanistan past the, quote, 2014 withdrawal. But then he had some words to share for all those naysayers out there who say that engaging in constant warfare and military meddling around the world is actually hurting the country.
America has rarely been stronger relative to the rest of the world. Those who argue otherwise, who suggest that America is in decline or has seen its global leadership slip away, are either misreading history or engaged in partisan politics.
Yes, apparently we're just misreading history, guys. America's never been better, and anyone who says otherwise is just trying to be partisan. That's funny. I thought that calling out both Democrats and Republicans alike for perpetuating policies that will cause the inevitable downfall of the American empire is the opposite of partisan. But Obama also went on to talk about how important the international community is when engaging in future foreign policy excursions.
International opinion matters. But America should never ask permission to protect our people, our homeland, or our way of life.
International opinion, like the enormous outcry from world leaders and Americans alike over the near bombing campaign in Syria. I'm pretty sure Syrians aren't interested in taking away Americans' right to shop at Walmart or eat fast food. But of course, his contempt for the international support wasn't the only Orwellian thing said. Obama's roundabout justification for the continued use of killer drones held zero water.
In taking direct action, we must uphold standards that reflect our values. That means taking strikes only when we face a continuing imminent threat, and only where there is near certainty of no civilian casualties. For our actions should meet a simple test. We must not create more enemies than we take off the battlefield.
Wow. So basically what he just said is that every single time he chose to kill human beings with drones, it was because Americans faced an imminent threat. He also said that he sends drones to kill only when there's near certainty of no civilian. So Washington politicians love to scapegoat illegal immigrants for this country's economic woes, but almost never do you hear about the illegal actions taken by Border Patrol agents themselves. Well, in 2012, an independent report on this very topic was commissioned by U.S. Customs and Border Protection, or CBP. It was completed in February of 2013. Except 15 months later, the report still hasn't been made public. See, last week we learned that CPB has refused to comply with an open records request to release the report in order to protect the, quote, free and frank exchange of information among agency personnel. Right. I'm sure it has nothing to do with the fact the report offered up a blistering picture of how immigrants are actually treated in this country. See, thanks to an investigation by the Arizona Republic, we know that at least 45 people have been killed by CPB agents since 2005, including 3 teenagers that were shot in the back. And perhaps most stunning is that no agents have been reprimanded for their actions. Furthermore, according to leaked documents provided to the LA